So we could begin if you wanted to backtrack a little bit on yesterday and fill in some of the gaps in the names and things. Bob, was that what you're suggesting? Or?
Well, at some point, I'll just tell you what I got here. It's not a whole heck of a lot. We've still got quite a bit of the agreement to go through. Let's see. I thought of the name of that guy, Billingsley.
Doug Billingsley.
Yeah, Doug Billingsley. He was the bad dude that was involved in reindeer. And he was basically dishonest. I mean, he was a good guy in a lot of ways, but he was just really dishonest, greedy, you know. And I can give you an example of my experience with him on that.
That shouldn't last long.
Okay, the federal negotiator to the agreement in principle was John Naismith. I knew it yesterday when we looked at the pictures, but then I forgot it. Yeah.
You'd mentioned his name earlier too.
Yeah, and he was a really, really fine man. He was a forester, which is kind of strange, working for Indian Affairs. But the deputy minister picked him as being, you know, a really good quality, intelligent man. So we had a really good team on the federal side there. So that's all I thought of for those things. My example with Billingsley and how crooked he was I was trying to get the, this is after the final agreement, I was trying to get the commercial harvesting going. And we had developed a pretty good routine for commercial harvesting, bring good quality meat in. But we needed a retail outlet to do two things. One is to provide an outlet for the harvesters, but it's also to supply what we call country food, you know, muskox and caribou and fish and whatnot, to the local people in Inuvik that didn't have access to these things. So we set up this company called Ulu Foods, and we were going to, you know, market this stuff, and we got a butcher in, and we rented a space from Billingsley in an old burnt-out building he had to do our butcher shop. So we rented it, and so he sent over, you know, a lease contract. So I looked at it. IDC was, because they were the only ones that had the money at the time, they were going to rent it. So I went through the lease, and it was fine. And I phoned up Peter Kulkin, IDC. I said, yeah, this is fine. And so he signed it. And then we went to leave a few years later, and we ran into a problem with Billingsley, because we had installed a whole bunch of walk-in freezers and coolers and things like that, real good, you know, holding storage area. And he said, no, you can't do that. They belong to me. And that son of a bitch had changed the lease from the time the copy I got to the copy that was signed, of saying, you know, anything you fasten, what do they call it?
Tenant improvements.
Yeah. They stay with the building. And unfortunately, this is at one of our meetings of the economic development people, and Jim Burke was there, and he was the deputy minister of renewable resources at that time. And Jim was a real decent guy, and he was supporting what we were doing. He said, this is really good. So in the first meeting with Billingsley, said, no, it's got to stay in there. He said, no. And he said, well, talk to my lawyers. You know, just, I don't have time to deal with you, just talk to my lawyers. So anyway, I went back into the paperwork and discovered what that little crook had done. So I called him back in, and I said, this is what you've done. And Jim Burke was just sitting there. He was all 350 pounds, you know, sitting there like this, looking at Billingsley. And Doug says, fine, go ahead. Take him out, you know. I never forgot that. Anyway, he became a good friend of Nellie's after that.
Billings it did.
Yeah, and she appointed him, I think, to the water board or something like that. Like, apparently he did a really good job. And then he died of cancer, really young man. But I didn't go to his funeral. Anyway, that's...
Was Jim Burke involved in any other aspect? You say you found a 902 is a very supportive person.
Mm-hmm.
It's very unusual as a senior bureaucrat within the government.
Yeah, well, his exposure to the Delta was as a wildlife officer.
That's right.
And he knew all the people. And
he told me one time that he had great respect for the Inuvialuit.
Mm-hmm.
Really had great respect.
Yeah. Well, he and I worked on the Porcupine Caribou Agreement. He was a big advocate of that. And Nellie brought him in because his the deputy minister she inherited was one of these bad biologists I was telling you about, like really arrogant. And he made all kinds of changes to the Wildlife Act and whatnot. They were just stupid. And so Nellie got in there and she kicked him out and put in Jim Burke. And things changed. Things changed a lot. But I remember that stupid guy, I forget his name right now. I shouldn't say that because he wasn't. He was just ignorant, I guess. He brought in this change to the Wildlife Act that prescribed what kind of rifles you could use for what kind of game. And it came out in that you had to use a rifle of a certain number of gigajoules of energy for polar bear and then one for, well, who the heck knows what all that means? So here at the Inuvialuit, they shoot polar bears with 222s. I mean, what the heck? No, that was against the law. So that was the kind of stupidity they went in for. So Jim changed all that. And, you know, he was a strong advocate of collaboration among all the groups. You know, he's just a good, down-to-earth, sensible man. I really liked him.
He's described as a consensus builder and a mediator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But he wasn't an ideologue, you know. He wasn't going to jump on anybody's bandwagon. He just knew, as a good human being and knowledgeable of the area and the people, what was right and what was wrong, you know. That's so. Yeah, he was a good man.
So Nellie was MLA at that time?
She was.
Government.
She was the Minister of Renewable Resources. She brought those changes. But changes started happening when Nellie got in there. Because that you were talking about activism. And one of the things, I can't quite put all this in years right now because I haven't thought about it for a long time, but I think George Erasmus was really going for self-government. Mm-hmm. Okay, that was his big shtick after the 1973 policy statement. He wanted to go for self-government. And he convinced the Minister of Indian Affairs, Warren Allman, that this was a good thing. So Warren Allman took it to cabinet, and he got totally shot down, just obliterated. And he lost his job, and then the deputy minister changed to try to keep control of that department. And they appointed Bob DeLury to that commission. What the heck did they call it? We always referred to it as the jury commission.
And I think that's the common term for it as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I know there's a...
And his task was to go into the north and consult with the local people and see what was wrong with the political system. So his report came out saying look, you don't need self-government. You've got a perfectly good form of government there. You just got to get your representatives in there. And so a lot of people like Nellie took that to heart. And they said, okay, that makes sense. We'll give that a try. So she got in. Dennis Patterson got in right after that. Oh, gee, a whole bunch more. And so all of a sudden, the native representation on the territorial government was really significant. And so that was kind of interesting how things changed that quickly. But now we were talking about activism, and George had this self-government routine. With CYI in the Yukon, it was Aboriginal title. You had to keep Aboriginal title to the land. And then we talked about extinguishment. These were all features of that sort of extinguishment debate. And it's kind of interesting when you look at how the Yukon solved that Aboriginal title issue. I don't know whether they ever looked at that. But they got over it, and what they did was they said, yeah, okay, we'll recognize Aboriginal title, but it doesn't mean anything, and if you ever want to do anything with it, you've got to convert that to, you know, the regular title. So they got absolutely nothing, you know.
But we're able to say they still had Aboriginal.
Yeah, that's right. That's all they wanted to do.
Yeah.
But that goes through about 20 pages of writing, if you could imagine trying to figure all that stuff out.
But is that, Bob, do you recall, or do you know, that was one of the basis for the Denny Métis claim to fall apart too, was it not? That whole issue, the principle, I guess, that some were arguing against.
Well, yeah, all I remember about that, it was something to do with extinguishment, so that could well be. Now, we were talking about the pragmatism of the Inuvialuit, saying, look, we had a chance to figure out what Aboriginal rights and Aboriginal title could mean. So, look, we're happy to give up some hairy-fairy notion for something that's real. And that brought a lot of resistance from the other native groups that hadn't settled, you know. But they all saw us as really undercutting their positions because we settled with the extinguishment clause, and so that undercut their position.
But in the claim, there was a provision that it's without prejudice to.
Yeah, any future stuff. Yeah.
Any future stuff for the Inuvialuit, but also without prejudice to other Aboriginal people pursuing their lands. So were they just afraid it was a precedent, even though that clause was in there?
Yeah. Now, I did a real sneaky thing in negotiations on that extinguishment because, and I was caught at the last minute by Ian Binney, who later became the Supreme Court judge. He was Assistant Deputy Minister in Justice, and he was a smart man. So right from the proposal, if you look at the extinguishment clause, I took it right out of the James Bay Agreement. I just copied it word for word. So that's always what I said. Look, this is what was in the James Bay. That's good for them. It's good for us. So what I knew about the James Bay and nobody else did was they weren't talking about the offshore. They were talking strictly land. So James Bay had exempted the entire offshore. and nobody caught this until a week before the final agreement was finished. Then we got caught. Now what could I say? Well, yeah, okay. Hey, I'm innocent. I just copied this out of James Bay. And I knew exactly what I was doing. But so anyway, we crafted what we did, which, because Benny wanted to go the full meal. He wanted to go way, way the other direction. We said, no, that's not going to do that. So we cut it back. But There's a bit of wiggle room in there, but not that much.
So I just want to see if I understand this. The Aboriginal rights as they are originally in the IFA extended to the offshore.
Yeah. Well, you see, what the sneak that I got, and I knew I couldn't get away with this. We were getting rights to the offshore, but we weren't extinguishing anything in the offshore. Well, hey, that's not going to fly. That's not fair, for one thing. But my negotiating strategy was always have a few little things that you could get them on. Like, if you're going to try to stick it to us there, I could stick it to you over here. So we'll trade. So anyway, it sort of worked. I don't know.
Now there's a story about maybe just that some of these points were still being negotiated right up to the signing ceremony.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think I touched a little bit on that. I told you about Simon, and he said, you know, Bob, I was spectacular in this cabinet thing. And he said, yeah, it's all good. So we set about the whole, you know, finishing up the drafting and the ratification business. And so we got to the signing, and there a lot of preparation went into that, you know. Nellie got Tuck all cleaned up. She got Eddie Grubman and all old dead skidoos in the people's yards to make Tuck presentable. But anyway, I was saying that I was the only one that didn't have my suit on there, because Monroe says, look, I want to meet with you. I think we were starting the ceremony at, you might remember, 11:30, something like that. It's in the morning anyway. He says, I want to talk to you. And he had his whole team there except no Simon. And there was a new deputy minister there at LaFontaine. So he didn't have anybody there that really knew what was going on. But he said, Cabinet's got a few things they want to change in this. Well, this is 2 hours before the signing, for goodness sake. And Simon wasn't there, and I didn't know why Simon didn't come, because this was a big deal to him. But I think he was embarrassed that they were going to do this. So Monroe comes in and he says, there were 3 things. 2 of them are really straightforward, they didn't matter. But the third one was, we don't want screening and review to apply to the offshore. Well, that was a fundamental part of what Simon and I had negotiated. I mean, the offshore was a big, critical issue we were dealing with. But again, I don't know this for a fact, but I was always suspicious that was Neil Faulkner. Because when Simon put his recommendation forward, Indian Affairs had a chance to put their recommendation forward to Cabinet. And I think he got that one through. And because the Trudeau government was so keen on getting this offshore development going, they, you know, invested a lot of money and effort into that I guess it flew. So I remember swearing at Monroe. And I had Michael Flavelle, our lawyer, with us. And so I said to Monroe, you give us a couple minutes here and let us figure this out. So what I came up with was a sneaky little plan. It said, yeah, it won't apply to the offshore except for wildlife compensation. Well, that seems pretty reasonable, except you can't have wildlife compensation without screening and review. So it was one of those terribly circular things, but if you really follow it through, we didn't give that up. Plus, we had the provision that the Inuvialuit could have screening and review on any project they requested. So, because this was such a convoluted drafting, I didn't want them to hang their hat on the fact that it didn't apply to the offshore. So Andy Carpenter wrote a note to the Minister of Indian Affairs and said, we want to provide the notice under this section that we can ask for screening and review of all offshore developments. So I thought we had that one pretty well plugged at the end of the day. But this goes back to what I was saying in being an enabling piece of legislation. If you don't get something one way, you can usually get it another way. So that worked up until a few people decided that they were going to interpret the final agreement according to what they wanted, and it didn't apply to the offshore. And they advocated this all over the place. One was the Yukon, one was John Bailey, the previous chairman of Wildlife Management Advisory Council, NWT. He was a bad dude.
So this is not the John Bailey, the lawyer, but
No.
John Bailey,
Yeah, he was a bureaucrat out of GNWT.
renewable resources, I believe.
Pardon me?
With renewable resources as well, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. But one of the things I was thinking about last night, and all the people that really worked to take advantage of the final agreement, or not necessarily defeat it, but take advantage of it. You know, the self-interest I was talking about. They all had a similar approach, and that was get rid of anybody who could challenge them on what they wanted to do. And without exception, that's the tactic they took. So they went after me, they went after Lindsay, didn't mess with Nellie. And there are a couple of other good, staunch, knowledgeable supporters. And they usually use funding as their excuse. These people cost too much. And that's how Norm and John Bailey, approached me. And Andy Carpenter came up and he said, look, these guys want to get rid of you. No. And they ended up succeeding, but just because I got fed up. But it was based on the fact that I was providing services to the Joint Secretariat, consulting services, and I was providing it to IRC. So they made the argument that IRC should have been paying me to help them. I said, no. IRC pays its own way. And look, we've negotiated all this money for you for implementation. You pay your way. And if you need help, then you're going to have to pay for it. Didn't want to do it. But that was just a tactic they used. So unfortunately, I just got fed up with, it was Roger Grubin and his stupid lawyer at that point, Jim Rogers, because they didn't want me to be around there, because I kept telling him, hey, you can't do that. Final agreement says you got to do this. No. We're going to do what we want to do. And then Norm Snow was the same way. So I said, forget it. I went down and worked for the GNWT. So, there's only so much aggravation you can take from your own team.
I guess in particular, since you were the architect and the author of much of the IFA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I do want to ask you a question about that again. And I'm both surprised but actually delighted to hear from you yesterday that you actually wrote many of the clauses of the IFA. Did it then go through a draftsperson, or who else had hands on that between what you did and what?
Michael Savell and I, and before that, our legal counsel and I, we did all the drafting, and most of it flew right by the government people. They were happy with it. It was straightforward. It's what we'd agreed to. Mm-hmm. And they didn't really have maybe the interest, or maybe they were lazy. I don't know. but they were happy with what we drafted. So let's just say we did a good job of drafting. So in looking back on, you know, the successes and failures of the implementation of the IFA, I sort of boiled things down to 4 or 5 points where the Inuvialuit exhibited characteristics that resulted in less than what I would expect out of implementation. I won't say failures necessarily, but, and I think they go like this. The first one is ignorance. If you don't know the final agreement, you're going to fail. Okay? Number 2, if you're stupid, you're going to fail. Number 3, if you're lazy, you're going to fail. And number 4, if you're interested in self-interest. And every single problem I saw in implementation came down to one of those things. And self-interest was a big one. Ignorance was a huge one. And so that's always why I said this. Information about the final agreement is so important. Now, I'll give you an example of ignorance. I don't know, you got me thinking about this stuff, and I don't really want to think about it, but when I went with the GNWT, we had everything sort of up and running with the Inuvialuit. And Parks Canada, Bob Gamble came to me and he said, look, we are trying to negotiate a national park over in Paulatuck. Oh, I said, that's an interesting idea. I know that country. It's a really interesting country. And he said, yeah, Paulatuck really wants it. Because Sax had got the Thompson River Park after that. So I think Paulatuck said, we want a national park too. So I don't know. I never talked to them about it. But he said, look, we want to offer them something to really sweeten this deal. Like I've looked at the North Slope Park, and I've looked at the Thompson River Park, but Paulatuck seems to want more. So what can I give them? And it was really on the wildlife side. So I looked at what they had. I said, well, if I were there, this is what I'd want. So I proposed a set of rights over wildlife management. So he was happy with that. I was quite surprised. Parks Canada said, fine. So I would have died for something like that in the final agreement. So anyway, Norm Snow sent down Richard Binder and this Jim Rogers, the IRC lawyer. So they come walking in with their briefcases, and they said, we don't like your proposal. We got that already in the final agreement. I said, what? I said, look, I wrote the final agreement. I know what's in the final agreement. No. We got that already. You're not giving us anything. Well, I said, look, you go away, look at the final agreement, and show me where you got this tomorrow, and we'll talk about something else. They never came back. So they didn't get that. They didn't get what I offered. Didn't get anything else. Now there's a classic example of ignorance and stupidity. And there was just way too much of that. So.
Now, so we're talking about really the early days of implementation.
Yes. Not the real early, but.
Yeah. But by that time I'm thinking particularly about Inuvialuit who have participated, people like Peter Green and Andy Carpenter and others. Had they moved on to other things
No.
at the time? Because I heard that
Peter had,
yeah.
but Andy stayed on until he died. Mm-hmm. Yeah. He was one of the real solid citizens. And I always regretted that he got seduced by Norm into this international interest. You know, they travel around the world, and that's exciting for Andy. You know, go to Africa and go to all these places, talk to people, and you know, basically sell the Inuvialuit message. But there was a whole bunch of domestic stuff at home that wasn't being done.
So people with the experience and the first-hand knowledge are spread pretty thin.
Yes.
On the ground of that.
Yeah, they were. And, you know, I told you I put so much effort into having these workshops, trying to get some training going so people would know. And I resisted by Norm, and I resisted by Gruben and IRC. So you can't go anywhere with, you know, IRC and the game or joint secretary aren't with you. Parks Canada was good. They really had an interest in the workshop. But nobody else. And I was very cynically, I really believe it's that self-interest that comes in. As long as I can convince everybody I know more about the final agreement than you do, then what I say goes. Eh? But that's a pretty dumb way to go about running your business when you got a jewel like the final agreement there. I mean, anyway, I'm getting into my. Hi, dude.
Hi.
Holy smoke!
It's going to be break time.
Good. I was getting into maligning characters here, so it's a good thing you stopped me.
Well, that's good. Maybe it's good I did. Don't know.
Yeah. Well,
Hello, by the way.
you're used to me maligning people, so
I don't know when you need a break, but when you do, there's.
Appreciate it, thank you very
And
much.
then you get
Yeah,
more
yeah.
of this.
Take 5?
Yeah, good.
Would you like a?
I'll get a pen here. As my memory comes in and out, I gotta write this stuff down.
Yeah, one handy, I could probably dig one out.
Oh, I can grab one. I had one yesterday. I don't know where it is. I'll be right back.
Oh, we've got pens here, Bob.
Do you?
Yeah. I'm not sure I have one here. Must have one. I hope I don't have your pen. What does it smell?
Oh, thank you.
Grab one too, though. Look at that, Inuvialuit. So, Bob, I think, you know, we want to, before we start rolling again here, there are a
Yep.
couple things that I picked up that we want to talk about yet. Some more about implementation and the people you were involved with, some of the successes, some of the failures there. Would like to get back to the IFA in particular and
Sure.
go through the, you know, the various chunks of wildlife
Sure.
corporations, all those sorts of things. Kind of, if we could follow the way that you laid it out in that highlights of the IFA document. Not following it word by word, of course, but you have certain headings in there that are the basic elements of the IFA.
Yeah. Okay.
Just
We can do
explain
that.
As if, like, and maybe just explain the IFA to me using those headings, much the way you did in that document.
Okay. My suggestion would be before we get into that too much, we go through how you read the final agreement and what's special
Okay.
in the final agreement. And that will sort of, I think, set the stage for what we should really be paying attention to and in the future, what you really have to protect. That, to me, that's important.
Sounds great.
If you don't know what you got that's special, and if you don't know that everything you got that's special, probably some bureaucrat's going to be trying to attack and change or modify. You just know those are the things you really want to protect. So now I can't wing this one. I gotta pick up my final agreement here.
Do we want Bob to introduce himself? We talked about
At some point, maybe at the very end of the day, or so we don't forget things.
One of the things we want to get on tape too, Bob, this is very administrative, but we'd like you just to introduce yourself.
Oh. Yeah, well. Yeah, well, I'm Bob DeLury. I fell into the job of being the chief negotiator for the IFA and had a great time doing it. It was, we had a great team. It was a great privilege to do, and I think we did a pretty good job. So I'm here to boast about the team. So this is my version that I developed of the final agreement. It's called the annotated one because I found that in reading the final agreement, you knew what you were looking for was in there somewhere, you just couldn't find it. Now, I worked with the final agreement more than anybody else, and I had trouble finding some things sometimes. So I annotated it, which meant we could find quickly what we were looking for. And I always promoted that what we needed to do was to produce an index so you could look something up and find it in the final agreement. And I pushed that very hard, and I did this one on my own, but an index is a really specialized thing that really takes a pro to do, and I needed some money, and nobody would provide any money to do it. It's been a great, I think, detriment to people using the final agreement not to have that reference. So I gather we're going to be doing that now, but this is my third copy, and you can see it's a little bit dog-eared. I've worn out my other two. Mm. So if you see somebody walking around with a final agreement that isn't all dog-eared, he probably hasn't read it. Certainly doesn't use it. So wear them out. So I just want to take you through the sort of what's special in the final agreement, and why are the negotiators so proud of what they did, and why the Inuvialuit should be proud of it as well. And when you know what's special in the final agreement, you'll know what it is in particular you've got to protect from bureaucrats in particular, and particularly when it comes to amendments. And I'll give you an example that has happened in the past without my knowledge until I looked at the latest set of amendments, where Indian Affairs was successful in making an assault on something that was really special in the final agreement. So somebody should explain to the Inuvialuit how this drafting is laid out, because it's a semi-legal drafting. We've got sections where you try to organize all the ideas according to the heading, and then you've got subsections, which is again a sort of the next level of detail down. And those are the first few of those in every section are very important, because they talk about the goals. What are we trying to achieve in this section? And all the details that follow should always tie back to the goals. And if they don't, we're probably not reading it correctly. So, so if we start right at the beginning of the agreement, it says Section 1, Principles. Now, we've got three subsections. Inuvialuit identity, equal and meaningful participants in the society, and wildlife, environment, and biological productivity. So everything in this agreement is tied back to these principles. So it's always good to refer back and say, well, how does this fit in? Because we're talking about, economic development. How does that tie in with the wildlife? How do these things all interrelate? And you'll start to see how complex this document is. Now, the next section that we look at, and these are very, very important, is definitions. So even though we use very common words, they have particular meaning in the final agreement. And there's an example here of conservation. If you ask people on the street what's conservation, you're going to get 15 different ideas. Well, if you read the provisions in wildlife where it talks about conservation, it's talking about the conservation that's defined here. And there's an awful lot put into the definitions. So I'll just take you through a few, and just to give you an example, but these are important in terms of what the provisions of the final agreement are. So we'll hit the first one. Conservation means the management of wildlife populations and habitat. Totally different concept. To ensure the maintenance of the quality, including the long-term optimum productivity. Totally new set of concepts of these resources to ensure the efficient utilization of the available harvest. Now, what is long-term optimum productivity? Well, it's a term that was used once in international whaling conventions, and you get to define what optimum productivity is. Now, if you speak with fisheries people, optimum productivity deals with biomass. How many fish, how much weight of fish can we produce? Well, maybe that's not of interest to the Inuvialuit. When you're managing and you're harvesting a lot, you change the genetic populations of your population, maybe, depending on how you harvest. But one example that I learned when I was studying biology is that in California, they have a very, very high hunting pressure. And so they take an awful lot of animals, and they brought in a law that said you could only shoot deer with forked horn or more. So clearly they were aiming at getting the older animals that might have died anyway. Then what the biologists found is after 10, 15 years of that, they didn't have any deer with antlers bigger than forked horns. They totally selected a gene pool for no antler development. Well, so their stab at productivity, management, was selecting for things they didn't want. Well, if you want to go in for particular kinds of caribou, let's say you're interested in trophy animals, you want to get big antlers. Okay, you manage one way. If you're interested in meat, you might manage another way. If you're interested, as we were in the muskox situation, of keeping your populations down, then you manage another way. So that's the sort of essence behind optimum productivity. Again, ask people on the street what conservation is, you're going to get 15 different ideas, but this is very specific to this final agreement. Now, development is important. I don't have to go into that, but exclusive right to harvest is an important one. Gives you all the parameters of it. Fish, fur bearers, game. These are all modifications of definitions you're going to find in wildlife legislation. So another big one, which is, I call it a bit of a sleeper, is this is the only agreement you'll find a definition for what the land rate settlement is. Every other final agreement is going to have the clause that says this is the entire agreement. Now, what that means in legal terms is if you're going to interpret the document, you just have the document. Nothing else comes into play. That's the entire document. So I said, that's not fair. So we turned it around and we said it includes the agreement in principle, this agreement, the settlement legislation, and all negotiations in connection therewith. So it's basically everything. The entire history is so critical, and I was always keen to keep very detailed records. Now, I want to come back to an issue I talked about before, is the importance of having arbitration as a dispute resolution mechanism, not a case in court. So what that means is when you go to the arbitration board in a dispute, you can go back through all the records of the negotiations. In other words, we're getting at intent of the agreement, what the consideration of the parties was, and so no matter who wants to twist the words around in the final agreement, you got them. Now that's very, very important. And no other land claim settlement has a provision like that in it. Okay, I think we talked about this preferential right to harvest. This is different than any other final agreement because the preferential right becomes an exclusive right in situations of shortage. Every other agreement, you just get a proportion of the allowable take. Subsistence usage, that's pretty straightforward. We don't have to go into that. And of course the definitions of wildlife and all that kind of thing. Okay, so all I'm saying is that these definitions are very important to the interpretation of the final agreement, and I understand what's going to be done is every time a defined term is going to be used, they're going to highlight it in the document. So it'll always remind you, hey, check back with the definition. Now, agreement legislative approval, the big thing here is that this agreement and the legislation that follows supersedes all other acts. So if there's a conflict between what's written here and some act that's passed either in the past or in the future, this prevails. So nobody's going to be able to erode away at your rights here by passing legislation. Section 4, citizens' rights and programs, that's pretty straightforward. Eligibility to enrollment. The Inuvialuit developed, long before the final agreement, a really good enrollment database, and that carried on through the initial enrollment. What this agreement says is that basically after the initial enrollment, which is passed, it's up to the Inuvialuit who they enroll. So when I'm asked about enrollment, I can't tell you what the provisions are now because that's governed by what we set up as bylaw number 1 in IRC. Now, when I was there, we basically set up bylaw number 1 to model what's in the final agreement, but that could be changed any time, and I gather it has been, and I don't know what it is. Corporate structures, not too much I have to say in this. This came out of the Alaska settlement, the corporate structure approach. So we've got the IRC and its subsidiaries, the land, community corporations, land corporation, development corporation, investment corporation, and a trust. That's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's anything really special in that, except the final agreement basically said, with respect to financial compensation, we're going to divide up the pots of money from development, which can have a lot of risk associated, and a certain amount has to go into an investment, which is a secure investment. So you're not going to get somebody coming in and blowing all the money on some speculation somewhere. This chunk has to stay there. So I think in large part that's been managed pretty well. There's certainly lots of good advice out there you can get from financial people. A lot of tax provisions in there, and that was the tax provisions in this agreement are pretty creative, and they were done by, we had a very creative accountant, Bob Brown, who ended up becoming a specialist in Aboriginal tax matters. Did a very good job. Okay, land. I think we've talked a lot about that before. We start out in the agreement in principle with the concept of royalties over all oil and gas throughout the whole Western Arctic region, and on our lands. We didn't own the oil, but we had other provisions dealing with consent agreements, which are like the participation agreements. And so the point was, we were taking risk in terms of the royalties, but we were spreading the risk over a large area, and the land was tied to other things. The government said, okay, that's fine, you can have your royalty, but we're going to cap your royalty provisions at $45 million. So you had all the risk, but you had a cap on the risk, so there's no upside. So we said, no, that's not going to work. So we took the $45 million, said, if you think that's fair, okay, $45 million, but we want to have some upside, so we'll take the ownership of the oil and gas on the, what are the A lands. The B lands are not surface title, they're everything minus the oil and gas. So, in a sense, you own the ground down to the center of the earth, and actually you own the water down there too. But you don't own mineral or the oil and gas. Okay, the access provisions are pretty straightforward. Government has a right of access, but basically most other people don't. Developers don't. We talked about that yesterday. What you'll notice in this agreement dealing with the wildlife side of things is that fisheries are always dealt separately. And I've been asked about that a lot. And the problem is that the fisheries department never did play well with others. They didn't want to be part of anybody else's regime. They thought they were so special that they wanted to have everything specific to fish. So they wanted public right of entry for fish, so we restricted that somewhat. But that wasn't a big deal to the Inuvialuit. The government was quite concerned about us owning sand and gravel, which is something we got in the final agreement, but we didn't have in the agreement in principle because it was considered a very scarce and valuable resource. And they said, well, look, you can't just sell it all off, you've got to save some for the communities. So we did. And I understand since, given the powers of the Inuvialuit, they decided to give some of those community gravel reserves off to build a road. So now they're going to have to find gravel for their community if they need it, and most communities do. What else is special here? Gosh, when I look through this, everything's special. No, but I'm talking about special in terms of unique. Okay, now I've been asked about this land use planning. I'm at 782. Our negotiator to the agreement in principle was John Naismith. And he was a forester, but he did his PhD in land use planning. He was really big on this. And his concept was quite a good one. So in the agreement in principle, a fair bit of time was spent directed to land use planning. And as John explained land use planning to me, it could be quite useful. Well, in our negotiations from agreement in principle to final agreement, we had this hiatus in negotiations when the Conservatives were in, and Indian Affairs spent its time trying to undermine everything in the agreement in principle it could. So one of the things they did was they set up land use planning. And they botched the whole thing up. But they had all these land use planning commissions. They threw a ton of money at it. And I think their strategy was, before the final agreement, let's get all this land use planning done the way we want it, and then that'll solve some of our problems. But didn't quite work out that way. They came into the Western Arctic and made all these stupid things. And it wasn't land use planning at all. It was, I don't know what it was. So we shut that down and basically gave it just a token reference in the final agreement. And as far as I know, it hasn't come back. It's still going in the Yukon, outside the Western Arctic region, but anyway, so you can see there's an awful lot of detail in lands and in dealing with things. We got an interim land regime, which is basically a holding pattern between the final agreement and legislation. I've been asked a lot about why are certain areas so special, like Husky Lake, Cape Bathurst, and the North Slope. Just immediately before I came on to work with Cope as a biologist, Nellie and Cope had negotiated the Husky Lakes, Cape Bathurst land freeze. This is very important to Tuck. And so they had the boundaries all set out. They put it under withdrawal, so it was a protected area. And so basically we picked it up from there and put it in the final agreement. It seems as if the people of Tuck have had a bit of a change of heart in that, given what I see them doing with their road. But we'll see. I don't know. Just everything I was told about Husky Lakes, Cape Bathurst, it was very, very important. Now, the selection process of the lands, I think I mentioned this a little bit yesterday. We had a lot of land to select, and we had certain criteria associated with how we could choose them. But the battle was to get the lands that the Inuvialuit wanted, and it was mainly the coastline. So if you look at the map of Inuvialuit lands, it's a continuous strip of Inuvialuit land from west to east. And that's very important for hunting. It's very important for access provisions. Nobody can do what they want to do inside, without coming to their lands. Tremendous control. Now, we were criticized as being sellouts because we agreed to not select proven reserves. Now people say, oh, geez, well, you didn't get anything then. But technically, a proven reserve is a defined term in oil and gas legislation. And there is only one proven reserve in the whole of the Western Arctic, and that was Atkinson Point. So that was excluded, but this looks good on the government side because they didn't know what a proven reserve was. So basically, I think it's 2 square miles on Atkinson Point is taken out of the selection. But we got the royalties to what's under there. So we didn't get total ownership, but we got the goodies. So same with the community sites. Those are exempted from our 7A land selection. But at that point in time, things were looking fairly promising under Tuck. So we said, yeah, okay, we won't select those lands, but we want the royalties from that. So that's agreed to. That's one of the royalty provisions. And that's one of the little sneaks we got in there that most people don't see. And I usually can't find when I look for it. But it's in there. Okay. Okay. Can I take a bit of a break here?
Certainly.
I just need to pee.
Yeah.
So that's Mike, in terms of the Joint Secretary. Now, I haven't met him, but he seems like a really keen guy.
He's a real straight shooter.
Yeah.
Doesn't mess around with words and doesn't waste his words, that's for sure. I think the staff appreciates the change.
Oh, God, yeah.
And there's been quite a turnover in staff as well, too. So there's a lot of new people that this will be very helpful for.
This is perfect, Bob, reading through the agreement, making comments as you go along, picking up.
Well, I know I'm missing some stuff, but I'm trying to make sure I catch all the main highlights. Okay, so we got up to Section 10 participation agreements. I've talked a little bit about this before, but what's unique about the final agreement, unlike any other situation in Canada, is if a developer has subsurface rights, he can't get access until he concludes this agreement with the Inuvialuit. Everywhere else in the country, they get access and you get paid compensation afterwards. They pay you for damage to the land and things like that. But what was more important to the Inuvialuit is to get participation, get their businesses, get their employment, get the terms of wildlife compensation, for example, the terms of the other features important to the Inuvialuit, sorted out before they get in. So everything's agreed to before they come in. Again, that was something that my good friend Neil Faulkner was trying to get rid of. So, environmental screening and review. This is totally unique. It's become a little bit of the model that the federal government has taken in some of their review process. I think I've told you in the agreement in principle, this was just one section dealing with wildlife compensation. None of us really knew what that meant, but it translated into screening and review and wildlife compensation, and they go hand in hand. So the first thing I'd like to point out, it's 11.1D, and this is what I referred to before, which says, developments in the Inuvialuit settlement region in respect of which the Inuvialuit request environmental impact screening and review. So this was set up to say, number one, it doesn't apply to Inuvialuit lands unless you want it to. Number two, if you think this agreement says doesn't apply to the offshore, it does. So 11.2 is the one that was dealt with in the last minute by the minister. So it says, each development subject to screening shall be dealt with in accordance with the procedure, principle, and claims set out under this agreement, except for screening and review for the purposes of wildlife compensation. The process described in this section applies only to the onshore development. Now that's the convoluted drafting that was done in the last minute, which I don't think is limiting to this.
Would you mind, Bob, just going over explaining what the intent of that in the application?
Well, this was a last minute change. Simon and I had always agreed that screening and review applied to the offshore, and the offshore was very important in this. Monroe came in the last minute and said, we don't want it to apply to the offshore. So nobody there really knew what the final agreement said, so I said, okay, we can give you that, but it's got to apply for wildlife compensation, which meant screening and review did apply. And he didn't know that, but he was happy. And I'm sorry for that confusion that was introduced, but that was a last minute thing produced by the feds. I thought that was the dirtiest trick I'd ever seen. Okay, now what's important about the review? There were other environmental reviews around, so we had some models to work with. Now, in this, I worked with Andrew Thompson, who was probably one of the world's leading environmental lawyers. And he was also the chairman of Canadian Arctic Resources Committee, hired me on. And Andy was a very creative guy, a very good lawyer. And he said the most important thing is that when you do the review, you do it on a worst case scenario. Now that's really critical when you get into wildlife compensation, because if you don't make that stipulation, then they don't know what they're dealing with in terms of the review. You know, best case scenario, nothing happens. Worst case scenario, everything goes down the tube. So you want the worst case, so you prepare for it. That's the point. And the worst case is really important when you get to wildlife compensation, because the purpose of that is restoration. So if you take a worst case scenario where you're going to be destroying all the beluga whales, for example, okay, now how are you going to deal with that? And then you really get a grip on the terms and conditions you should put on it. Now, the review board has a provision that says, look, we'll put our recommendations forward. If you don't like them, if you don't want to implement them, you have to send them back and give us another shot at it. And that's really important, that second kick at the can. Now, we said in the last section there, 1132, nothing in this restricts the government for doing its own environmental reviews. Now, I understand that debate's going on right now about they're wanting to revise the environmental legislation. And the question came up, should the feds have a duplicate or a parallel process? And according to what I've been told, they're happy not to. They're happy that with the review provisions we've got should be the ones that prevail. Now, I understand they've come a long way toward that, but it's not there yet. And they're trying to deal with that right now. And my argument always is, unless the federal review process can adequately deal with wildlife compensation, they shouldn't be involved in it, because that's such an important component. But generally, the federal government's pretty happy with these provisions.
Well, was the intent when that part was written that the Inuvialuit process will only kick in if it was deemed that the federal or territorial land use review is not going to be adequate?
No. No, this is one of the rights. Okay, we were talking about prescriptive things. This is one of the rights the Inuvialuit have. So all we're saying is that if the Inuvialuit exercise their rights, it doesn't kick the feds out. Okay? But the feds can't kick us out. That's the main thing. So when I get into the screening part and the amendments that were made that I found so offensive, they found a little way around some of that. Now, that has implications not only for the review section, but it has implications for the Yukon North Slope, because the screening committee and review board have a very, very important role there. And we can talk about that. But those are the big things in the review board. Now, where am I at here? Oh, we get into the Yukon North Slope. Okay, oh boy. What's special there? Just about everything. So, I think I explained at the time of the agreement in principle. Okay, let's go back. Our proposal did not include a wilderness area or a national park. It included a certain amount of Inuvialuit private land on the eastern portion of the coastline. The Yukon went ballistic with that, and we said, well, okay. The federal government, because of the Berger inquiry recommendations for a national wilderness park there with special hunting for the Inuvialuit, because he had recommended that, I think Hugh Faulkner, the minister, wanted to show that they were paying attention to that report, and so he proposed that national park, wilderness park, across the whole North Slope. So that's how we got that. And the Yukon went absolutely ballistic. We were cutting them off from the coast. They had a concept that they were going to have some big port up there. It was a sort of, we always call it the Balkan mentality. Cut off from tidewater. So what ended up being proposed, and I think the Yukon had a fair part of this, is that we have a national park on the western component. East of the Babbage River would be a special conservation area. Now, we built the special conservation area up as tight as we could in terms of dealing with conservation interests. Now, one of the tools we used was called a withdrawal order. And the importance of that is a withdrawal order can only be made by cabinet or in council. So that involves all the departments in the federal government. So on the conservation side, there'd be CWS, there'd be parks, there'd be fisheries. So if you've got Indian Affairs saying, we want to do something up there, you've got 3 other departments that might say, hey, maybe, maybe not. So the language I picked here, Simon agreed that we should put the withdrawal order in there as a conservation tool. And he agreed that it should be maintained. Now, the Yukon has always come up with the argument, as Indian Affairs did before, was maintained doesn't mean anything. Well, if you take a common sense use of the word maintained, if you maintain your house, you maintain it, you keep it up. You don't just keep it for 5 years and then throw it out. And that's what they wanted to do. Now, my interpretation of maintained, in terms of what the spirit and intent of the final agreement was, is that, okay, before I get into that, let me just say, we made provision to change that withdrawal order. According to a screening and review, they deemed the development was in the public interest, that public convenience and necessity outweigh the conservation or native interests. So that's a very severe test, and it's used in the National Energy Board all the time. So it's well known. That language was suggested by Simon because he was familiar with it. So it's not some harebrained guy who wants to go up and start a mine. It has to be in the public convenience and necessity. In other words, if you have to build let's say a defense radar site or something like that, you know, something that's big and in the public interest, that's the whole of Canada's interest, not just somebody in the Yukon, then the withdrawal order can be taken off. Now, the other important thing about maintained, and that's why I had to digress, is you keep it on until it meets this test. It can be withdrawn, but when that public convenience and necessity is no longer there, okay, the radar site becomes obsolete, for example, that withdrawal order goes back on. Like the Yukon has the notion that if they can once get it off, then it's gone forever. It's not. It goes back on again. And that will be a constant source of dispute. And because they have these lawyers that say, no, it doesn't mean that, it means something else. Well, it doesn't mean that. And this is where our dispute resolution mechanism is so important, because if they push that, they're going to end up with their knickers in the ringer.
That's through the arbitration process.
Through the arbitration process, yeah. Yeah, they can't go and create a whole narrative of their own. And that's when you bring in the people that know the final agreement, for example, myself or Liz Snyder, or we can bring documents from the negotiations, and we kept very good ones. Julian Brown kept very good. So we made certain allowances for the offshore needs on our slope. Stoke Point, for example, limited scale use, temporary use, and let's see, what else did I want to say about the Yukon or slope? The harvesting rights are slightly different than the Western Arctic. In terms of negotiating the final agreement, the Yukon being really belligerent guys decided that they would enforce their wildlife regulations to say that Inuvialuit were non-residents, so they could go and hunt up there without a guide, and they couldn't bring back caribou across provincial boundaries without a permit. Well, hey, you're down there in Whitehorse. What are you going to do for a permit? So this dink for a negotiator, he pushed this through the Yukon government. They were going to enforce this. So he sent up a whole bunch of these permits into a clavic. So the clavic, the NWT fellows had to administer this. So what our guy did, I forget who it was right now, what our guy did was he just posted them out in front of his office. Hey, you want to go on? Take one. So they made a bit of a joke of the whole thing. And of course, trade and barter was a big issue in the wildlife harvesting, and the Yukon wanted to become real dinks about it. And they said, no, you couldn't do that. Couldn't trade it, couldn't barter it. So we got that in here because everybody said it just makes sense. Now, what else on our slope? Of course, all the provisions of the park are kind of special. So here's this 1239, Inuvialuit need not obtain permits, licenses, and other authorization. Okay. Of course, the economic benefits on the North Slope, wildlife management on the North Slope. Oh yeah, here's one. The Wymack North Slope was charged with wildlife wildlife conservation and management plan. And Lindy and I spent a long time talking about what that might mean. And I thought he did a very good job of drafting an initial plan. And it went into Northern Affairs, and they wrote a document back saying, no, that's no good. And that's when it really surfaced that they were not in support of the whole withdrawal concept, that they wanted to remove that. And they said, we don't support it. It's not our interpretation of the final agreement, and we want it to be off. So I was down in Burns Lake by that time. Lindsay sent this to me, and I went absolutely ballistic. It was such a piece of crap. And so Lindsay just reminded me of this a few years ago. I wrote a 16-page memo to him, which you can find in my reference manual. And they were just wrong on every point. And I was so mad about that. I went down to Ottawa and saw the ADM, Hiram Bobier. And I said, what the hell are you guys doing here? You know, what are you guys doing? You're just going amok, running around. There's a final agreement. It says this, and you say you don't support it. What the hell are you doing? Never heard from them again. So I must have really been smoking down there. I don't know. Now, let's see. Okay, now, wildlife compensation. I think I touched on this yesterday. I'm sorry I picked that title because people always equate compensation to paying money. That's not what's really important in this one. Yeah, money's involved, but it's not what's important. And I just point people to how you have to read every section of the final agreement. The goals are in 13.1, A and B. 2 goals. Everything's got to tie into that. So the first objective is to prevent damage to wildlife and its habitat, and to avoid disruption to Inuvialuit harvesting by reason of development. Okay, to avoid it. If damage occurs, to restore the wildlife and habitat as far as practicable to its original state, and to compensate Inuvialuit hunters, trappers, and fishermen for the loss of their subsistence or commercial harvesting opportunities. So that's a tremendous obligation on the developer, because they got to restore, prevent, and then if they screw up, they have to restore it, and they have to take care of the Inuvialuit interests in the meantime. So if they, let's say, wipe out the beluga so the Inuvialuit don't get any beluga, they've got to find a way to restore that, and they've got to find a reasonable substitute for all the beluga products. Now, what that would be, I'm not sure. It's easier to think about substitutes in situations like caribou. You can always supply reindeer, or you can get caribou somewhere else. Or maybe people will be happy with bacon, I don't know. But in any event, there's some reasonable. But, I mean, Mark Nixana always referred to the muktuk as the Inuvialuit mashed potatoes. So I don't know what, maybe Mark would take mashed potatoes over muktuk, I don't know. But whatever the substitute is, that's sort of why the review process is so important. Worst case scenario, beluga, what are you going to do? So it's not after the fact you're trying to figure this out. They know ahead of time that if they don't get muktuk, maybe they're going to have to provide T-bone steaks. You know, I don't know. Lobster, I don't know. All I'm saying is that that's done ahead of time. And so that's the main thing about wildlife compensation. The rest is, they're details. So, wildlife impact assessment, potential liability, worst case scenario. I think I've been through that. Oh, this other point I'd forgotten about. If a developer is actually caused wildlife harvest loss or future harvest loss, if he can't meet his obligations in terms of restoring this resource, then the federal government backstops it. In other words, they've approved this as well, so they take a certain responsibility for liability if it goes wrong. And that's very important. And when you think about the North Slope, if the Yukon's all keen to have a development go ahead, and they know that they have this responsibility at the end of it, maybe they're not going to be quite so gung-ho. So I think we've covered the absolute liability. Did we do that adequately? Okay. I get certain soapboxes and I don't want to get off them. Okay. Let's see. Okay, I've said with respect to fisheries, they never played well with others, so they wanted their own system. And I think that's worked out okay. They were very reluctant to even come to the table. So we go through a fair bit of management processes. I think they're fairly advanced concepts. On 1442, let's see, Inuvialuit shall have first priority with respect to any commercial activities related to wildlife. That's pretty straightforward, I guess. Okay. I don't know if there's any other confusion in this. I mean, I think it's all pretty straightforward about what people's responsibilities are. Now, here's an interesting, unique provision. And Jib Works supported this. Well, neither one of us knew how it was going to work. Is that when the hunters and trappers make a management decision, let's just within their area, they do it through, their bylaws or motions or whatever, they get this passed, that becomes law under the GNWT wildlife ordinance. Mm-hmm. So, in other words, the local lawmaking comes right down to the hunters and trappers. Now, I didn't know how that was going to work. Certainly the government didn't know. So it was Donaghy that figured out a way, and I'm not sure it's the best way, but I got to give it to him. He did this. He took the wildlife ordinance, and he said, look, we went to Andy Thompson. He couldn't tell us how to do it. So, he'd really run out of options. So he went to the lawyer, who was he? The one that worked on the James Bay Agreement. A really good lawyer. So he suggested just take the final agreement and stick it in the wildlife ordinance. So they took all the provisions, the wildlife provisions, in the final agreement and made its own GNWT ordinance. So it says it can force it under, so it's easy for them to make regulations under their own. So you'll read the wildlife ordinance now, and there are these different schedules, for white guys, and then for every land claim settlement, there's a separate one, and it works. I think the way it works, at least it did when I was there, is the hunters and trappers would pass this, and then it would go to the GNWT, and their legislative draft people would just write it into a regulation in the form that they wanted, and then it'd be posted. So it was a really smooth process. As awkward as it was, it really worked well. Okay. Now, where are we at here? Financial compensation, I think we've talked enough about that. That's pretty straightforward. Economic measures. Well, this is a bit different, and obviously we know what goal it's trying to achieve. We did get what's called Economic Enhancement Fund of $10 million. And that came about because Simon had proposed in the negotiations in terms of doing some economic benefits for the Inuvialuit, what he called a 10% edge. What that was is in Inuvialuit making competitive bids could go 10% above. Now, he was quite comfortable with that. I didn't know how that was really going to work, but he was quite comfortable with it. And before we finished negotiating the final agreement, he got enough blowback on that he says, I'm going to have to go back on this one. So he said, I told him I can go back on it, but it's cost you. It's going to cost you. So he proposed $10 million. How he came up with that, I don't know. 10 for 10, maybe 10%, $10 million, I don't know. Some people wanted a bit more. I said, yeah, that's fine. So that was an economic enhancement fund, and that's a little bit different. I think some of the blowback he was getting was from the Yukon government, but probably from other places too, I don't know. But the interesting thing to me about the economic measures is that there's a review after a certain number of years, and that was undertaken. Now, I wasn't around when they did that review, I know Lindsay was, because he was intimately involved in the economic measures. And he told me, but you'll have to get the whole story from him, that in the review, both parties agreed, number one, that these goals have been met with respect to the regional, IDC, and that kind of thing. Okay, so that was good. And they both agreed that it still wasn't good in terms of the communities. So they directed themselves to that. But that's all I know about it. So he can fill you in on all the details in that. But Simon was quite good in the negotiation of this. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in there. Arbitration, I've talked a lot about that. We set up the arbitration board, and we got all first-class people in there, and they're all sympathetic to the Inuvialuit. Nellie got her former Deputy Minister of Justice to be the chairman, Steen Law, and he's still there.
Yes.
Yeah. And, I mean, they haven't done anything for a long time. And, of course, the GNWT put really sympathetic people on. Even the Yukon put guys on that were really good. So nobody stands a chance in there. Okay. Yeah, I think there was something else in here I wanted to deal with. The approval process, okay, that's pretty straightforward, that's all done. I think it deals with yeah, the last one is section 20, transitional consequential provision. So this has particular importance for the Yukon. What it says is that this agreement isn't intended to inhibit or advance the devolution of transfer of the jurisdictions of power from Canada to the governments of Yukon or Northwest Territories. However, this is to remain neutral. It's a separate agreement. It's not pushing anybody's agenda. So the second provision says Canada agrees that where its jurisdiction or powers devolve on or are transferred to other governments, it shall ensure that such devolution or transfer does not prejudicially affect the carrying out of its obligations under this agreement. Now, I've raised this with Lindsay and a number of other people, and they can't answer the question, so I just flagged this for people. In the devolution of land management powers to the Yukon government, they had to keep the withdrawal order in place. That was clear. But our mechanism for removing the withdrawal order at the federal level, and this was very deliberate, it had to go to cabinet. So you had fisheries, CWS, you know, all the other interests. Now, Yukon doesn't have that. They don't have a fisheries department in the sense that we have federally have a fisheries department. You don't have a parks department in the same sense that you have national parks. So what does it mean to go to cabinet? What does it mean to... And I would argue that Canada should have ensured that if there was a decision on this, the federal departments would be represented, or that it had to go to the federal cabinet for the withdrawal order. That's how I would have argued it. But nobody paid attention to it at the time, so I've just always flagged that as something that they should turn their attention to, because it's going to someday probably be very important. Okay, well, that's most of it. So there's one other thing which we can do after lunch, is where the Inuvialuit screwed up and let the federal government amend the agreement.
So with the, I'm just off camera here, so what causes that?
Basically, I can find it here for you, but it's basically most favored nation is whatever anybody else gets in self-government, we can get too. So let them knock their heads against the wall and we'll get it too. So the floor on that was Northern Quebec Agreement, because they had a lot of what I would call really good self-government provisions. But okay, now I was going to deal with this amendment business. Now I got to find this again. Okay, there's 1117. That's the last one. Here it is, 11.2. So, I've stated my strategy always was to the Inuvialuit, get whatever amendments you want through, and then don't amend anymore. Anything the government puts forward, it's probably bad because they're trying to get back something that you got in the final agreement. So when I was preparing for my workshop in the North Slope a couple of years ago, I hadn't looked at the latest copy of the final agreement. And I was just reading through these provisions, you know, say, oh yeah, I recognize that one, and I hit 11.2, and I just flipped. So where the heck did this come from? I mean, this was clearly government inspired. So where did it come from? So I talked to Lynn, and he says, you know, I don't know. I was really busy when this amendment package went through. Phoned up Norm and said, where the heck did this come? He said, I don't know. I don't know. So I phoned up Nellie, and she says, Norm wanted it, and Fred wanted it. I said, why? He said, oh, they're going to save money. Save money doing what? Well, you won't have to screen these things. Well, I said, it's not your money, and this is one of your rights. What the heck are you doing? She said, oh, I was just trying to appease them because they were so adamant they wanted this. But they never owned up to it. And so I made a point in that workshop about telling you how silly this was. And so they sure weren't going to own up to it after that. So I think we've talked a bit about it's an Inuvialuit right to have developments screened to check for environmental impacts, wildlife impacts, or any effect on Inuvialuit harvesting. And it's their right to do that. So 11.2 removes that right. It says no environmental impact screening or environmental impact review is required to be conducted in relation to a proposed development that A, is to be carried out in response to a national emergency for which special temporary measures are being taken under the Emergencies Act. So my first question there is, what are we talking about? What are we talking about, this Emergencies Act? I don't know what that act is, but I don't think these people knew either. Now, my basic proposition is that any governmental activity that requires any kind of a permit, any kind, is subject to screening. So I can't believe any emergency measures that the government would take would be totally unfettered. In other words, they send a crew up in an emergency and say, do whatever you have to do. I can't believe that would happen, but I could be wrong. Okay. I don't know what special temporary measures could be, what it could include. I have no idea, and it's not spelled out here anywhere. Okay, the second exemption is to be carried out in response to an emergency such that carrying it out forthwith is in the interest of preventing damage to property or the environment, or in the interest of public welfare, health, or safety. Now, what the heck does that mean in the context of environmental impact screening? Again, whatever the measures might be, if there are going to be conditions attached to them by government, therefore it should go through screening. I mean, these sound motherhood and good and benign, but if you don't know what they mean, then pretty soon all kinds of things start getting plugged into these provisions. You know,
Well, they might have had something like creating a fire break, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
But then the wording that leaves it open to other kinds of things as well
Yep.
that might not be.
yeah. Now, I just had another example. How about preventing damage to property or the environment in the case of flood control? Now, can you build a hydro dam there and say this is flood control? You know, it's just all kinds of things that this leaves open. Is exempted by way of an exclusion list to be established by the screening committee of classes or types of developments which would not have a significant negative impact on air, water, land, or renewable resources. Okay, so what they did was they took an Inuvialuit right and they gave it to the impact committee, which is only half Inuvialuit, to decide on these things, class of things, which wouldn't have a significant impact. But they just say air, water, land, or renewable resources, but they left out harvesting entirely. So all kinds of activities could be affecting harvesting, but would be affecting anything else. And so it's left out entirely. There's an Inuvialuit right that's out the window. And in reading this, I thought, this is not under environmental impact. Any of these three things. These are worded like access agreements. Like your rights to assert your private property, no trespass, is exempted where this emergency action is required to go in. Let's say you got to send a rescue party in. Well, nobody's going to prevent that. So that would clear that question up. But these are not access provisions. These are in the rights of environmental impact. So very, very poorly worded, very unclear, and significantly took away from an Inuvialuit right. So clearly the people that wrote this didn't really understand the final agreement and the significance of these things, or the style in which it was drafted. So there's a real danger to agreeing to what government is putting forward in the way of amendments to things like this if you don't really know what you're doing. So you always better have somebody around that really knows what they're doing.
It's like having an open backdoor of a piece of software that you wrote.
Pardon me?
Like just a means of access. I'm selling you this software when really you're not reading the fine print. I can still get into your computer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep. Now, the next amendment they made is to the new 1117. So it deals with, upon receipt of a project description, the screening committee shall expeditiously determine if the proposed development could have a significant negative environmental impact and shall indicate in writing to the government authority competent to authorize the development that in its view, okay, the first one being no significant impact and the thing could proceed. Now this is the new one. The development, if authorized, subject to environmental terms and conditions recommended by the screening committee, will have no such significant negative impact and may be proceeded without environmental impact assessment and review. So they were expanding the power of the screening committee to setting terms and conditions, which may or may not be taken by government, but there is no recourse the way there is in the review board. If they write a permit that doesn't accord with your recommendations, they have to send it back to you. There's no requirement to do that for the screening committee. So in seeking more power, they didn't get the tools they needed. This is not the way to deal with that issue. The other thing, and I mentioned this earlier, screening committee really doesn't have the mandate, the scope, or the resources to deal with wildlife compensation the way the review board is supposed to. So they've cut wildlife compensation out in this option, except for if it happens after the fact, you can claim compensation. But the whole preventative nature of the review board dealing with wildlife compensation is lost through this.
Because it's the review board that deals with the compensation and
Yep.
the screening committee.
Yep. And then that's all part of the recommendation that goes forward to government, and if government doesn't agree, they have to send it back. That's all lost in this. So now, I knew when I wrote the final agreement that this boundary between screening committee and review board was going to become problematic. It's just too clear cut, if you like, you know. Give it, either the review board does everything or not. So I always recommended that they find some, first of all, expeditious way for the screening committee to deal with matters. So now they've got to be sensible. You can't deal with all matters the same way. Real simple, straightforward things, you should make the whole process real simple and expeditious. More complex things, more difficult things, you have to have a little bit more thorough review. And this boundary could have been solved, I think, more appropriately by taking the Environmental Review Board and making it be the group that deals with all these matters in the way we talked about in a really expeditious way. So marginal things you deal with in the review board in a simplistic way or a simpler way, and more complex matters like offshore drilling or something like that, this big, you have a full-blown review. That was my sense of how they should do it. Now, when I was responsible for implementation, one of my big jobs, of course, was to get all the IFA institutions up and running. And that involved bringing a lot of new staff in, getting a whole bunch of bylaws and institutional arrangements going. And I got some really, really first-class people in all these jobs. And I'd like to go through just a list of some of them, because I think this goes back to the tremendous credibility the Coke people had in attracting good people. Now, the screening committee, I got a gentleman by the name of Carson Templeton. He was an engineer, environmental engineer. He came out of Manitoba, and he's the one that designed the flood control system there. He was really well known. He got independent intervener status at the Berger Quarry, which is quite a feat, and he did a darn good job there. So he was really familiar with the whole environmental scheme of things, and he was very skeptical of engineers, and he was very thorough. So he became chairman of the screening committee, and we talked over this problem with him. So I had confidence we had a good man there. The review board was Andy Thompson, the environmental lawyer, world class. And Now, I forget the first review he carried out. Environmental review. It was a big one. I think it was something to do with the offshore. But he just demonstrated the model for doing a really good review board. It was expeditious, clean cut, everybody knew where they were, and boy, he just ran that like just a pro. So he set the example, really good one. For legal counsel, we got Graham Garson, who was a real find. And Graham's history was he was the youngest judge out of Manitoba, and he was instrumental in being a judge in Aboriginal communities, and he's the one that brought in the whole concept of restorative justice. He's a very sympathetic, sensible man, a really, really good lawyer, and he was the head of the Law Society in Manitoba at the time. And we were looking around for a lawyer, so we put an ad in there. I think it's their, I don't know, the Lawyer's Review anyway. And Graham was responsible for putting all those ads in and managing everything. And he read it and he said, gee, that's a job I'd like. So he came up, and it was just a stellar interview. And so he came in. He was our first legal counsel. And he just loved it up there. He and his wife sold their house and moved up. And he was just settling in for the long haul. He just loved it. Really, really good lawyer. And he ran into immediate frustration with Roger Grubin. Roger was doing all kinds of things that didn't accord with the final agreement. And, you know, he kept coming to me in total frustration. He says, I can't tell him not to do this stuff, but you better go tell him, Bob. So I did. Not that that did any good. But he was a really fine man. He ended up taking a leave of absence because Manitoba government said they needed a really good deputy minister of justice. They wanted him to come in and clean up the department, which he did. And then he told Roger Grubin, yeah, I'm free now. I'd like to come back. And Roger says, no, we don't have a job for you here because Jim Rogers has been hired. But we have an opening for an accountant if you want that. So he went and worked for Nellie as her deputy minister of justice, and that's where he died right there. But it was a sad thing. So I got Norm Snow in the Joint Secretariat, which turned out to be not the best choice. Got Ewan Cotterill, who used to be deputy commissioner, I think, in the NWT. And he was pretty active in native rights, and he was pretty active in environmental matters. And he sat on our screening committee, so he was good. Now, who should I get for the fisheries guy? He was a really good guy. See if I've got his name. Yeah, Bob Bell. He worked for the GNWT, really familiar with the Inuvialuit. He came up north into Aklavik as a school teacher, actually, then went on to the territorial government with the wildlife people. And he was a really solid guy, and he came on as the chairman of the Fisheries Joint Management Committee. So, really solid man. We had Lindsay, of course, in the North Slope side, and he was really familiar with what was going on. He's been about the longest term member there. So I felt I'd done a pretty good job of staffing it with good people that could carry on and really do a good job of implementation. And I continued on as an advisor with the Game Council Joint Secretariat and IRC until basically Roger just drove me so nuts with what he was doing. I was getting pretty unhappy there. And then Norm Snow decided that, you know, I was too much trouble to deal with, so he set about to find a way to get rid of me. And I was saying earlier that this was a common thread among the bad people that have worked for the Inuvialuit. They'd pick out the people that really were good, and they'd find a way to undermine them and get rid of them. So Norm found a way. Pretty soon what he was doing was, I was trying to get this implementation things going. I told you I did this annotation one myself just because I needed it. And I thought it was a really good idea to produce this table of index. And so I wanted to get some money to do that. And he said, no, we don't have any money. Well, he had money coming out of his ears. But he just didn't want that done. And he knew if he put enough roadblocks in my way, I'd quit, and I did. Went and worked for the GNWT. So that was the end of my term there. I've come back to help out whenever I needed to. The other important thing in implementation is we had two really good people, very, very experienced, working on the enrollment. That was a big project. And we had two people. We had Liliane Duchesne. She was one of our secretaries there, and she's the one that developed the whole database for the enrollment process. A masterful job. Very complex. I mean, the genealogy of the Inuvialuit was a fascinating business to sort out. Like we'd ask people who their relatives were and who they were associated with. Pretty soon we found out that a lot of people didn't know who their parents were. You know, they'd been adopted out really early. And you'd pick this up when you looked at what the other charts were. So this is really fun to discover all this. And then part of the initial enrollment, we had to have government representatives on there, and we had Liz Snyder. And the three of us worked on that, and it worked really, really well. It was just first class. So I don't know what's happened. They've all left now, so I don't know what's happened since then.
But did that was based in part on the initial enrollment or voters list, is that correct?
That came out of our,
That came out.
yeah, that's right. We developed the voters list based on the work that we did in genealogy with Liliane and Nellie. Okay.
Okay, so that work went on before the IFA was ratified.
Yes.
Is that right? So,
Yes. So
because that was a question that's come up, how was that initial voters list developed?
the same way the eligibility list was voted. But we knew, just because we didn't have enough time, we knew that we didn't have everyone. So the voters list wasn't just the eligibility list. All we knew is that all the people on the voters list were definitely eligible. So they were all the people that we had access to. But we knew there were all kinds of people outside the outside world we hadn't been able to get a hold of. And so you'll see on the eligibility criteria, the first one is you were on the voters list. Because we knew at that point in time who you were. And then we had the enrollment process going on afterward, and that was a joint government Inuvialuit endeavor. So that went on for quite a while. I forget how long. Several years anyway. And we turned up all kinds of people. People that nobody even knew were Inuvialuit. And I went up there, it would have been end of the 80s, I guess. And one of the people there said, oh, you'll never guess who came in and enrolled. I said, no. Daniel Day-Lewis, the actor.
Oh,
I didn't know that. he didn't know that. He was just traveling in Canada and somehow, yeah, he was a thrasher.
Huh.
Now, who would have thought? Okay? Now, I assume that's true. I was told by the people in enrollment there. Okay, who did I get? Oh, I missed the gentleman that I got to head up the WIMAC NWT. And that was Bill Mayer, and he was a retired CWS man out of Edmonton, and he was just first class. Everybody admired that man, and he was so happy to come up and work in the north again and work at the Inuvialuit. Yeah, he was really good. So, okay, so I think that those are the people that were involved. The only other thing that I just wanted to say was the real challenge in initial implementation is that as I was talking about the resistance that occurred after the agreement in principle with the change of government, the Inuvialuit Final Agreement was the last act of the Trudeau government, and then Mulroney, the Conservatives, came in, and they didn't have the history or the interest that Trudeau had in land claim settlements. Not that he was opposed to it, but it gave room for all the people that didn't like the final agreement in Indian Affairs, and Neil Faulkner in particular, all kinds of leeway to do their administrative bad doings. And so basically in implementation, Diane approached us. They were in charge of the government's implementation. They approached the final agreement as just helpful suggestions, but they were really going to do it the way they wanted to do it. And so, of course, we hit the funding issue, and they kept saying, well, what do you need this money for wildlife research for? I said, well, you can't, these people can't do their job without knowing what the facts were. And then, oh, we had hundreds of reasons for this. So everything was just like pulling teeth. And that's really draining, but you know, it's doable if you know what the final agreement says and the rationale behind it. They don't have much to say. So that's still going on today. Maybe not to the same extent, but there's another thing that actually works the same way, is that if you're hiring new people on or having to deal with the government that's a new person, not familiar with the final agreement, is that they just rely upon their experience and whatever other job they had to try to address the question that's there. And or they can come from another land claim settlement. You know, in Indian Affairs, they move around. But the IFA is so unique that none of that experience equips you to be a real good practitioner in any of the functions around the final agreement. So that's just going to be an ongoing problem, and that's why this education program is so important. You know, you get a new person in government and implementation, you give them the course, you give them my 275 questions, and when you answer these, you can deal with this. You know, it's that kind of thing. They'll have a platform. They won't have to learn on the run, because that learning effort is going to have to be expended by you if they're not going to do it, if they don't have the means to do it themselves. Mm-hmm. And so it means you're constantly educating people about what the final agreement says. And after a while, you'd rather not have to do that, you know. So it'll take time, but I think we'll get there. Oh, I just mentioned so Dave, we didn't talk about self-government, and I don't know whether you want to.
Well, I think insofar as provisions in well, maybe there's a couple of things. One, was there an opportunity to be more definitive about self-government in the IFA? As you say, you've got there's clauses in there that permit or enable or give authority for that to happen. They're going to be dealing with self-government as a separate module within this e-learning program. So we should talk a little bit about that. Be interesting to know what kinds of discussions, what the thoughts were at the time. Yeah, another thing I wondered about, well, and I don't know if this has any bearing on this, but during the negotiations or the implementation, whatever it came in, there was this Western Arctic Regional Municipality.
Mm-hmm.
Is that related at all? Did that factor in? So maybe we should talk about that a little bit as well.
Okay, let's go back then and sort of tie those pieces together. We knew from our experience with Alaska that they had solved their self-government through their borough system.
Right.
So, and we knew what James Bay had done. So we proposed a Western Arctic Regional Municipality without any more flesh to it than that. Just, this is our regional government, if you like. This is our municipality. And we hadn't thought it through that much. But that was our attempt at it. And then we were talking about other Aboriginal groups, bandwagon. So the Dene Nation was self-government, George Erasmus. That was a big deal. And Cabinet absolutely turned that idea down. Said, no way, Jose, fired the minister. And so we knew that was a dangerous territory. And I took the attitude is, look, this final agreement is supposed to give you rights and powers that any government, any self-government would be happy to have over all the key things: your land, your wildlife, and your resources. Access, everything a self-government could, in concrete terms, give you. So why put the energy into this sinkhole of self-government? What do we want to get out of it? And I had a hard time answering that. I couldn't see what else anyone would want to do. But clearly that vision isn't shared in the current frame of mind. So, I mean, there's obviously things like education. James Bay settlement solved that through a type of self-government and education. And I understand that's working fairly well. I don't know that firsthand, and I haven't checked in on it recently, but I gather they were pretty pleased with how that worked out. So that's not a bad model. I don't know what models they're talking about, but so what we put in there in the final agreement was, with respect to self-government, what we refer to in shorthand is most favored nation clause, which again is a UN piece of terminology. And what that means is, whatever anybody else gets, we can get too. In other words, you can invoke your most favored nation right, and it's yours. So my attitude was, let other people knock their head against the wall for as long as they want, and we'll just take the best one that comes out. So that's just a wait and see attitude. So whether they've ever used that most favored nation clause, I don't know. I don't think they could have, given that this has gone on so long. I mean, basically that effort started after the final agreement. People got going on that. It's still going, and I don't know what they're doing.
My understanding is that they link the self-government with Section 35 of the Canada Constitution. I think there's something enabling in that. They may look at a few things here.
I don't know, but I can't comment. I can't make an immediate link between those in my own mind, but I don't presume to know what's going on. So I wish them well, but I would just caution the Inuvialuit They're a small population of people. In any population, you've got an even smaller number of really good people. Now, you're going to have to make a choice. Where do we put our really good people? My preference, this is just my preference, it's totally up to them. I'd put my good people in IRC, Game Council, Joint Secretary. Put it where your rights are. Those are things that really matter. And, you know, everybody in the North thinks they're a politician. They think that's the first thing they run. Well, okay, if you want to go into politics, I guess that's fine, but I'm just thinking from a strategic Inuvialuit self-interest point of view, leave that to somebody else. I mean, I can certainly understand the desire to get education under your control. And I think everybody in North America feels the same way. You know, that's not a unique feeling. But it's a tough field, and again, I think the Inuvialuit are really capable, if they put their minds to it, of attracting really, really good teachers and developing a really, really good school system. Doesn't depend on everybody else in territories. I think they can do that. And to me, that's a really practical way to go about it. And every pocket of good schools we get in the city or anything like that, is the parents get together with the teachers and say, we need good people here. And they support it, and they get the good teachers. And the good teachers will go where there's that kind of support. And good teachers make a world of difference. So, anyway, that's all I've got to say about that. Those are my prejudiced opinions.
Well, you know, it's a big step for the Inuvialuit, as you say. Self-government has some, I guess, you know, some benefits. I know they look at taxation as something new under the self-government, that there'll be possibly more revenues, taxation revenues coming into running government.
That's true, and that's certainly what the North Slope did. But the North Slope turned it around. They took this money, which is taxation money, and they put it right back into the communities. So, first of all, to a large extent in the Inuvialuit situation, they'd be taxing their own people. See, North Slope, they were taxing the oil companies. So I don't know whether you want to tax your own people to support garbage collection and water supply. I just don't know whether you want to do that.
Well, or perhaps people are taxed already, so rather than those tax revenues going to GWT, they go to the Inuvialuit self-government. I think there's some thinking around.
Yeah, okay, but I mean, my question is the taxation collected in the Western Arctic sufficient to support the Western Arctic? I suspect that they still need money out of the GNWT. That's my guess, because it costs, the municipal services cost an awful lot up there. So unless you've got a, you know, oil well or refinery or gas plant or something there that you can tax, where you're taxing somebody else to put it into your pocket, I don't know. I really want to do a good analysis of that.
And one hopes, I think they have, you know, they spent a lot of time on it to look at the pros and cons, and maybe they were allowed to do a little bit of cherry picking here and there too. I don't really know.
Well, they're pragmatic enough. I'm sure they will. But,
I mean, this started under Nellie's supervision, you know, under her leadership, and I can't imagine her leading people down the wrong wall. But with everything,
but Nellie's really good at you know, sucking money out of governments, you know, and spending it where she wants to. And not everybody's got her skill in that. And so, Anyway, I can't comment on what they're actually doing. I'm just sort of giving you my own views on it, based in just in ignorance. And as with the final agreement, it's totally up to them. Their decision, their world now.
Yes. Well, as you pointed out several times in things that you've written there, the rights, responsibilities, also the obligations.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of three pillars that have to be
Yep.
recognized and met for us to be successful.
Yeah. And, you know, as long as the Inuvialuit keep treating governments with respect, as all the old people always did, not they didn't criticize them or anything, but they treat them as human beings with respect.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as the governments treat them with respect, they'll get things worked out.
Mm-hmm.
And if the government doesn't treat them with respect, there are 15 different ways the Inuvialuit can make sure they do. So use the final agreement for that. You can really go to war with them if you want.
Well, you know, there's always government inertia, and I think that I suspect that that's one of the things the self-government will have to address, is that government is very protective about its programs. You know,
Mm-hmm.
the GLUT, after many, many years, had responsibilities. Their programs evolved from the federal government, and now
Yeah.
a lot of them are going to be further developed through not only the Inuvialuit self-government, but
Yeah.
Witchin and
Sure.
Pucho and all the other ones. And it's a new way of doing things, a new
Yeah.
way of doing
Yeah.
business for governments.
Yeah. So,
So, you know, if you stand back and look at it, there are perhaps things that are best done as a collective. I'm speaking about all the governments now.
mm-hmm.
And there's other things that should be addressed more closer to home.
Mm-hmm.
That's the sorts of things that will take a while to sort out.
Yes, it will. Yeah, I don't think anybody's got a master plan, a template of how it should look. But yeah, there'll be lots of challenges ahead.
But the Inuvialuit are good negotiators now.
Oh yeah,
It's a practice.
yeah, and they'd be even better when they get through this information course.
One hopes. Yeah.
Yeah, oh, I'm sure they will. Well, anything else you'd like to talk about?
Well, you know, you've touched upon it over the last few days, Bob, and I mean, you just touched upon some of it now. Well, actually, you went more than touched upon it as well. But you know, if you had a number of, say, a group of 5 or 6 or 10 young Inuvialuit who are working either for the government, let's say some young Inuvialuit working for IRC or perhaps going into the self-government office, whatever, but working for their people. Or, I mean, 4 or 5 things that you would encourage them to do. How should they prepare themselves to discharge the responsibilities under the IFA? Ensure that, you know, the best they can do for the future.
Well, I guess in simple terms, I think that being armed with the final agreement is the first step. To be really successful in most jobs that I'm familiar with anyway, there's an awful lot more you have to know. That is, the final agreement is set in the reality of all kinds of other legislation, all kinds of other policies. And in order to do a good job at what you're doing for these organizations, you've got to know all that. And that's a fair bit of schooling, that's a fair bit of learning on your own.
Mm-hmm.
There has to be a fair bit of tutoring in terms of people that have been through that and done that. And I guess that comes back to what I think I was saying earlier. Under the final agreement, you need to know so much more than just what the agreement says. You've got to know where it fits in. What are the other things you've got to know to put that whole thing in context to make your knowledge of the final agreement more effective? That's all. What I guess I'm getting at here is you can't just learn the final agreement and say that's all I need to know to do any job, because it's not. There are a whole bunch of other skills, a whole bunch of other knowledge you have to bring to bear. But what's different post-IFA is, in order to do your job effectively, you do have to know the final agreement. That's just a basis. So I don't know whether that's helpful, but
Absolutely.
good. Good. And I wish everyone all the best of luck. Great future. As I fade out into the sunset again. Oh, it's really nice to see the young people coming up and showing so much interest and promise. That's wonderful. I mean, it's being like a parent, to have a kid that grows up to be really keen and
Yeah. As you know, lots of challenges, lots of issues.
oh yeah. Well, it's not going to be dull.
Yeah.
No. But there'll still be time to get into mischief, I guess.
There's probably a lot of mischief making going on. So what do you think, Dave? Anything else?
Well, that was brilliant. I mean,
Yeah.
So much information in the last 2 days. It's going to be hard to cut it down to just even an hour. You know?
Yeah.
I just say thank you for your time. This is brilliant.
How about you, Bob? Was there anything else?
Not that I can think of, but
That's
look,
things-
why don't we just take a break?
Sure.
And then, what is it, 2:45? It's still too early for a beer, probably. But I was just thinking, take a break and we'll just
Yeah.
decompress a bit. And
Sure.
we'll see if there's something else that comes up in our conversation. We can come back to it. Does that sound good?
Very good.